It's a very optimistic note. Do you agree with this, John?
I think that all these three people are naive in the sense that they
Are naive?
naive because they fail to recognize the fact that communism is not just a self-contained unit in its country.
Magandang araw po sa inyong lahat. Ako po si Sir JR ng Usap Usap University. Kung ikaw po ay baguhan, welcome po sa U3. Ang atin pong palabas dito sa Usap Usap University ay atin pong inaanalisa, atin pong hinihima ang mga argumento ng mga debate, ng mga diskusyon. At sa ating episode ngayon, ito po ay isang special request po via Facebook. Ito daw po ay isang debate noong 1950s, 1954. So akala ko yung oldest na debate video na napanood natin is noong 1956. Akala ko yun na yun ang pinaka-matanda, pinaka-old. Pero ito po pala, 1954 ng isang Filipino debater noong 1950, teenager na debater noong 1950s. So excited ako, although the video is in English, magbibigay po ako ng aking opinion sa Filipino. Hindi po katulad nung dati na nagbigay ako ng aking opinion sa English. I think this is very interesting. I'm not sure anong pinag-uusapan nila dito. So samahan niyo po ako. Pero before that, sa aking background po, ako po ay dati pong university debater sa loob po ng 3 taon. Ako rin po ay nagdebate sa ABS-CBN News Channel. Kalaban ko po FEU at Lasal. At ako rin ay miyembro ng isang international na public speaking organization na Toastmasters International. So what are we waiting for? Medyo maikling video lang po ito. Samahan niyo po ako ha. Let's go.
The North Herald Tribune. How does the problem of communism in the United States compare with the problem of communism in other countries, and is there more than one solution? First of all, from the United Kingdom is Peter Hudson.
Okay.
To him, this tall boy from Norway is Gunnar Aslan. He's been staying at Bentley High School, as you can see from that enormous button that he seems to be wearing on his lapel. This is Vangalya Ram from India. He's just spent his final day in Pearl River. Pearl River High School gave him such a beautiful present, a traveling clock, that he's especially pleased and proud with that. Finally, here's Johnny Antillon from the Philippines.
Johnny.
Well, how about it, boys? How does America's communist problem compare with the communist problem in your countries?
The problem of communism in the United States is a psychological problem. The problem of communism in India is essentially born of frustration, a direct consequence of British imperialism.
I'll take you up on that in a minute. Well, in Britain, the problem is more or less the same as in America. Only in Britain, the difference is we don't call it a problem.
Well, I would say that the communist problem in America is much more difficult than our own problem, because in the Philippines, the communists act in the open, while here in America, they remain hidden.
Actually, I don't think the communist problem in America is more difficult than in Norway. I think the real problem lies in the way you are handling communism.
Coming back to what you said, Johnny, I thought you said that the problem of communism in the United States was more difficult. How would you, suggest a remedy for that?
Well, I will not sit you like a prophet and tell you what to do about your own problem. I do not pretend to know all the solutions against communism, although I will say that one of the best ways to combat communism is to take a militant stand against it. And one of the best ways to show your militant stand is to outlaw every communist party in every country in the world.
No.
Wow.
By doing that, you're using communist methods against the communists, which is defeating your very purpose. It is highly undemocratic, I think, to outlaw the communists, because that is the essence of democracy, to have difference and to give the opportunity for expression.
I know, but there should also be such a thing as limiting freedom. There is a distinction between freedom and license. A rattlesnake is dangerous. It would be undemocratic to limit its freedom in theory, but it is also wise to limit a rattlesnake's freedom.
Yes, but you are not
Analogy. Wow, ang galing naman nun. I like that. I'm quite concerned about this if this is already scripted. I think the first parts of their introduction were na parang scripted. I feel na merong parang teleprompter sila prior to the actual discussion point. Kasi kanina ko napansin nyo parang yung opening statements nila, especially from the Norwegian guy and then the Indian guy, he seems to be looking at the teleprompter, but that doesn't matter. I think mas naging interesting nga yung nagtanong na yung Indian about sa perspective ni Johnny Antillon. That's a nice analogy nung tinry niya na kumparahin yung isang ahas. At sinabi niya nga na while in theory, okay naman na bigyan mo ng kalayaan yung isang rattlesnake for example, pero kinakailangan mo rin limitahan ang kalayaan na yun dahil nga sa nature nito na delikado at venomous.
taking it for granted that every communist is a traitor. I am not quite sure of that. I think it is wrong to persecute a whole group because of some mistakes on the part of its members. I don't doubt that there are communists who spy against the country. I don't doubt that there are communists who conspire to overthrow the government. that you cannot persecute a group as a
Everyone.
whole because some of its members are criminals. Criminals should be punished as criminals, and you shouldn't persecute people for the sake of their opinions. And another thing, if you take the human rights away from the communists, well, why should the communists be interested in preserving democracy? I think that if you take away from the communists the freedom of expression, they will turn traitors.
I want to say that the communists already are traitors. They cannot turn into further traitors. I want to bring out this point. I want to state that every communist party in every country of the world is not a self-contained unit in itself. It is a branch of a world conspiracy with headquarters in Moscow. And the best way to cut off the body is by cutting off its arms.
But there's one thing, Johnny. You see, you can prosecute a certain person only the moment he becomes subversive to law and order, but not till then. Till then, it is his right to express himself, at least in a democracy, if it claims to be a democracy.
The minute a man joins a society with the avowed purpose of killing you and cutting your throat, he becomes a traitor to that society. He puts himself outside the pale and protection of the society because he totally rejects it.
But only after he makes an explicit statement of his purpose.
And does he not make an explicit statement by joining it, by signing up for it, by giving an oath that is going to turn against this government?
Peter's been trying to get a word
Isn't
in
that
here.
explicit enough?
I don't think so. You can't punish a man until he's committed a crime. At least in Britain you can't. You can't punish him for the thought.
I'm not punishing him for the thought. I'm just saying that he's joined an association of murderers. For instance, here is a group of 10 men. They've drawn up a plan to cut your throat. Then one man of the 10 actually goes out and cuts your throat. Does it stand to reason that the other 9 should be irresponsible or should be free from the blame?
I don't accept your premise that they're out to cut our throats.
And what else do you think that they're supposed to do? When they want to overthrow our society, overthrow our government, institute their own regime, institute their own reign of terror? What else do you want?
Wait a minute. Wow. What a very bold and aggressive debater we have here. Grabe tong Pinoy na to I don't agree with this premise, but I just felt na this was the call of the times during that time. Tanda, 1950s po ito eh. And then the Communist Party in the Philippines started in, I think, 1947. Hindi ako nagkakamali. The Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas, PKP. So, hindi ako ganun kasigurado and I cannot ascertain exactly yung political atmosphere nung panahon na yan sa Pilipinas, pero it seems to be quite intense kasi kung nakikita nyo, for Antillon talagang menace talaga sa society ang communism in his opinion. And nakikita mo na talagang passionate siya sa kanyang sinasabi. In fact, so far, ang nangyari sa discussion, it's 3 versus 1. Tatlo itong from Norway, India, tsaka UK versus the Filipino. Ang galing kasi he's very young, he's passionate, and he's well-versed. I like also how I could hear a lot of Spanish-Filipino accent sa kanyang pagsasalita. And actually, sa ating previous video, nung ating Brother Eli video, sa kanyang experiences, he mentioned na nung high school si Brother Eli, he mentioned na meron silang Spanish course or Spanish subject sa high school pa lamang. Ang assumption ko is sa panahon ni na Mr. Antillon, nung high school siya or nung elementary siya, meron silang mas malawak na exposure sa Spanish language. Kaya makikita mo yung kanyang R, very Spanish, the problem. Interesting yan sa akin na makita yung difference sa kanyang accent kumpara sa ating kasalukuyang panahon. Dahil sa paligay ko, most Filipinos now tend to speak with an American accent. Yung parang, kumbaga, ating imitation ng American accent. So, nakita ko sa kay Mr. Antillon, hindi ganun. So, I appreciate it and it's very refreshing sa aking tenga.
There are more ways of cutting a throat than simply drawing a knife across it.
Well, but those people who plan to do this are individual persons. You cannot persecute the group as a whole because these individual persons are criminals.
I know.
How do you deal with them in Norway, Gunnar?
Well, in Norway, of course, we are quite afraid of communism because Norway has a border with Russia and we are in quite a dangerous position. But it is more of a security problem. There are not too many communists. The Communist Party is very small and it is decreasing from election to election. As I said, the problem is the security problem. But I think that the best way of dealing with communism as such a problem is to handle it in secret. I think it is terribly wrong to leave it to politicians because politicians will always be on the look for votes and publicity. And they will make so much fuss about their affairs that any intelligent and dangerous traitor will get into a safe hiding place a long time before it comes to an investigation. So therefore, I believe that the communist investigation should be carried on in secret.
By the way, if I may put in a word about Gunnar saying that you should not prosecute the Communist Party because the individuals carry it out, I do say that even if the individuals are the ones who commit the crime, they do so upon the orders of the party and according to the plans of the party. Remember that a party is composed of individuals. Whatever the individuals do, the party is guilty of. The party is not an abstract idea. Whatever its members commit, then that is what it is guilty of.
Wow.
And then your second point, Gunnar, about saying that investigation of communism should not be left to politicians, I agree with that. And I want to add something more. I want to say that it should never be the function of the legislature of any country to inspect or to ferret out communists. It should be left to the executive branch. And then the executive branch should gather the evidence, while the judicial branch should find out how to evaluate this evidence and then prosecute the man as he should be prosecuted. But a man should never be put in a position where his innocence or guilt is in the shadows. He should never be placed in a position where, whether judged guilty or innocent, he's still condemned in the eyes of society. A man should be tried only by the courts, because only the courts have the power to say whether a man is definitely guilty or definitely innocent. Any other way would be judgment by anticipation.
No, John, it is a difference between feasibility and morality. But returning to your point of conducting the investigation in secret, I think that is entirely undemocratic. Because who is going to conduct them? Is it the people or the government?
Wait a minute,
And if it is a democracy, then it should be the people and not the government.
Wait,
And therefore it should be in the public.
I
and in
thought
the
that
open.
in any orderly state you had a police, and I most certainly didn't believe that it was left to the people to catch criminals. I thought that the police was there to protect the people.
He didn't mean a secret trial, Ram, I'm sure.
Precisely. He meant, Ram, the secret gathering of evidence. But the actual trial of the man, the actual presentation of the evidence will be brought before the public.
Yes, it should be
See?
brought before the public.
Yes, and I think there are things that are still worse than outlawing the Communist Party. I think that it is still worse when you don't have any lines to operate according to, when you don't know what is right and what is wrong, when you don't know what you will be suspected for and what can pass. I was rather shocked after I came here once when I talked to a boy who didn't dare to go to a Russian movie because he had parents in the State Department. Another time I heard a congressional subcommittee ask a person whether she had ever had a certain newspaper, ever subscribed on a certain newspaper. And I was shocked about it, because I thought that in any democratic country there would be such a freedom of expression that anybody could have the newspaper he wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, personally, I think outlawing the Communist Party is lazy. It just stresses the incompetence of a country to deal with it. But I want to get on to Ram about this British imperialism. Would you explain what you meant by
Well,
it?
just a minute, please, Peter. Why are you going to attack my point and transfer your argument to Ram? Isn't that unfair?
No, it is related to it.
Oh, wait a minute. Give Johnny one word. Go ahead, Johnny.
He said that outlawing the Communist Party is a lazy method of fighting the Communist Party. I don't think so. I think you're taking a definite stand against it. And you're giving all your actions a legal basis. Where does laziness come in?
Well, because, well, you see, when you have a Communist Party in the country, that party is a real danger.
That's
But
right.
the Communist Party can never be prosperous unless there is some dissatisfaction in the country, unless there is poverty and illiteracy. And therefore, the government has to deal with this poverty and this illiteracy in order to defeat communism. Therefore, I think that communism is not at all doing only bad things. But if you outlaw the Communist Party, you simply don't get this benefit.
Look, what
Wait, all right, give Peter a chance.
Right, Peter.
when I say it's lazy, I mean it's just pushing the issue further away by outlawing it. You said the situation in America was more difficult because communists are hidden here.
That's right.
If you outlaw your Communist Party, all you'll do in effect will be to drive it underground, away from being in the open, to behind the scenes, and then you have a problem difficult.
That isn't so.
Okay, nagets natin yung point dito no ni Peter. Sinasabi niya dito na kapag ginawa mo kasing illegal or against the law ang isang ideolohiya, ang sinasabi niya is mas lalo sila magtatago, hindi sila ma-reveal out in the open. So ang sinasabi niya is magpapatuloy pa rin yung kilusan pero underground nga lang. Yun ang sinasabi niya. On the other hand, sinasabi naman dito ni Johnny, yung Pilipino, sinasabi niya na hindi. Talagang menace sa society ang communism and is very, very adamant about it. So sinasabi niya talaga na no, hindi yan pagiging tamad, hindi yan lazy na approach.
Now look, you contradict yourself. If it is really so that it would drive them underground, Instead of being lazy about it, why not let them stay in the open? Because that way we could catch them easier, according to your reasoning.
Yes.
However, you said that by outlawing them, that would drive them underground, and therefore would make it harder to catch them.
That's what I mean.
It's not? Now let me point out that it is harder to catch the man when he's underground. So the element of laziness does not enter into
When
it.
I said lazy, I meant that you were pushing the issue further away.
You are not pushing the issue further away when you recognize a danger and you take steps to mitigate that
To
danger.
push the danger further away from yourself, you're not doing anything by
When you
outlawing.
recognize that a man has a fever, that is not pushing the issue away.
I grant you that. But
Oh,
you can't just
naturally.
say, I recognize he has the fever, and then leave it at that. Put him in an isolation
But you
ward.
can do this. You can say, I recognize it's the fever, I recognize it is bad, and because it is bad, I will take measures to prevent its further spread.
And not do anything to him.
Why not do anything to him? Cure him.
Okay, before that, at tingnan niyo po yung sa kanyang body language, yung kanyang mga kamay nag-outstretch ng ganyan. Tandaan po natin sa psychology, lalong-lalo na po sa body language, when you're opening your hands like that, it means being open. It means revealing yourself. It means that you are showing your vulnerability. So that is very brave body language that I could spot from Mr. Antillon. Kumpara mo naman dito kay Peter, itong British na makikita mo dito sa screen natin ngayon, nakaano siya, yung isang kamay na nakaganon, parang a bit more defensive. So isa po yan sa mga palatandaan na makita mo na ang debater ay confrontational or not, or has self-confidence or not. So napaka-confident dito ng Filipino debater. Isa nga sa masasabi ko dito, makikita mo talaga yung passion ni Mr. Antillon sa kanyang paniniwala. So early 1950s ito yung panahon na nakikipagnegosasyon. Please correct me if I'm wrong, nakikipagnegosasyon si Magsaysay sa mga leaders ng Pukbalahap. Tandaan natin kasi nagkaroon ng koneksyon yung mga rebeldeng sundalong mga Pilipino laban sa Hapon. Nag-evolve yan into an armed group na kumontra sa gobyerno. Dahil nga worldwide, noong 1950s kasi ito yung golden era ng pag-spread ng communism sa iba't ibang bahagi ng mga bansa.
But you're just curing him by outlawing the fever like that.
No, the point is this. By outlawing him, you recognize its evil. And the minute you recognize its evil, you take steps to remove that evil.
Do you want to tell us what you're doing in the Philippines, Johnny?
Well, it might take a little bit, but I'll just give the general background. I'd like to say that a few years ago, the civilians in the Philippines were more afraid of their army than they were of the communists. This was because the army had committed abuses against the civilian population. But a few years ago, a man was sent to the Philippines, and one of our Filipino leaders, and he cleaned out the army by reorganizing it. That man's name is Magsaysay, and he's now our president. The first thing he did was to make it punishable by death for a firing squad, the abuse of any civilian by any soldier. After a few court-martials and a few executions before the firing squad, discipline was restored in the army. He did many more things to restore the morale of the army. He removed the subversives within it, and then he divided the army into small, compact units which could strike with deadly efficiency and deadly mobility at any point within the Philippines. But that
Like for what, Johnny?
strike against any communist in any part of the Philippines.
I see.
There was a time when the army was such a big, it was unwieldy. But by dividing it into small, efficient compartments, he could distribute it anywhere with fast.
But you didn't tell us that there were guerrilla communists all over the Philippines, and that was the reason why he had to do this with the army.
Yes, that
Now
is
tell
one
us
of the
how he
reasons.
dealt with the guerrillas.
Okay, I think yung tinutukoy dito ng moderator is sina Luis, no? Luis Taruk. Kasi isa sa mga highlight achievements ni Pangulong Magsaysay ay ang pag-surrender ng hook leader na si Luis Taruk sa kanyang pamamahala. Tandaan din po natin, nakita ko kasi dito yung confidence ni Mr. Antillon sa gobyerno ng Pilipinas nung panahon na ito. Si Magsaysay po, sa mga bagets po na hindi po nakakaalam at kinakailangan yung malaman ang ating kasaysayan, tinuturing na greatest president si Magsaysay dahil nga sa kanyang mga nagawa sa kasamaang palad, hindi niya natapos kasi yung kanyang full term. Ang nangyari po sa mga hindi po nakakaalam ay nag-crash po yung kanya pong sinasakyan sa Cebu sa, I think the name was Mount Manunggal. Yun ang naalala ko sa history lessons ko. So sayang, no, maraming nanghinayang, maraming nalungkot. Siya rin, kung di ako nagkakamali, ang pangulo na nagbukas ng Malacanang para sa publiko.
Now, the point is this. It is not enough to kill a communist. As much as possible, it would be better to bring a communist alive and change him to your ways of thinking. So what Magsaysay did was this. He put in a program of land reform, which in simple terms was this. He said, for every communist without a criminal record, there is a piece of land for himself and for his family. Therefore, if that person has no criminal record, he can come down and become a capitalist. That is why I'm fan of saying that one of the best ways of treating a communist is to make him a capitalist.
Wow! Amazing, amazing. Pero yung question dyan, 2 points na kinakailangan kong i-mention dyan is, sa ngayon na nangyari, kasi ito, panahon nila napakainit kasi talaga communism, socialism versus capitalism. Interesting how the current quote-unquote communist states now are not purely communist countries. So kasi pag sinasabi mo kasing communist, it has to be purely self-sufficient, pero kinakailangan pa rin ng outside and external support and trades with other countries na nangyari nga sa lahat ng countries except for North Korea and Cuba. To some degree, meron silang concept ng self-sufficiency or self-insufficiency dahil nga sa kanilang pagiging hardcore na mga socialist countries, yan po ang Cuba at ang North Korea. But going back, so lahat maganda yung reaction ng lahat ng sinabi niya ni Mr. Antillon na the best way to change a socialist, isang komunista, ay gawin siyang kapitalista. I like that. I like
the
that.
communists in your country into capitalists. Why should you be so afraid of the communist propaganda? I think you must realize that the dangerous communists, the intellectuals, will remain communists anyway. They are not influenced by the communist propaganda, they will go underground. But the reason for outlawing the Communist Party, I think, must be to prevent communist propaganda. And I can see that communist propaganda would be dangerous in a prosperous country where people are satisfied.
You see, Johnny,
But you see,
Wait, let Ram have a turn.
the point is that the methods that were adopted in your country would not quite work in our country, because the basic assumption was that poverty and illiteracy produce communism. But as we find it worked, it doesn't seem to be working that way. Because in India, while you do have a great deal of poverty and of illiteracy, you do not have communism rampant in those sections. Paradoxically enough, communism is most rampant among the educated people and among the rich people.
Okay, that's an assumption. Kasi sinasabi niya na hindi pag-uumpisahan ng komunista ang pagiging mahirap at illiterate. That is a wrong assumption by the Indian debater here. Kasi dalawa naman lagi yan yung pag-i-introduce ng isang political ideology. It could be an ideology that is outside of quote-unquote the domestic culture. Kung sa kanilang kultura, political culture, wala silang communism, it is exported usually. Ang pag-export ng idea ay nagmumula of course sa mga literate class, sa mga nakapag-aral, normal yun. And it will trickle down papunta sa mga nasa baba, sa mga peasants, sa mga farmers, sa mga mahihirap na mga citizens ng bansa. But regardless, ang point ng discussion na ito is paano mo i-handle ang isang ideolohiya katulad ng communism. At pangalawa, gusto ko ding sabihin, how do you kill ideology? Kasi nakakagawa tayo ng mga bagay-bagay, especially sa mga wider na political actions. It could be militant, it could be violent, whatever. We are influenced by the ideas that were implanted in our brain. Kaya tayo nagpo-push for something, for a social change, for example, na nangyayari nga noong 1950s. Ang issue kasi dyan is, kahit na gaano pa karami ang papatayin mong tao, hindi mo mapapatay ang ideya na nasa isip nila. So, ang kinakailangan mo talaga dyan, if you're the government, kinakailangan mong labanan ng ideya ng isa ding ideya na mas mabuti. Kinakailangan mong yung ideya na ito, lagyan mo ng backup ng reform, lagyan mo ng backup ng mga batas, lagyan mo ng backup ng edukasyon. Kasi kinakailangan ma-feel ng mga tao na the government is there. Nagkakaroon ng pag-aalsa dahil merong certain level of dissatisfaction sa gobyerno. Ganun po talaga yon. So unless hindi satisfied yung mga tao sa kanilang gobyerno, magkakaroon, hindi lamang ng komunismo, magkakaroon pa ng iba't ibang uri ng ideolohiya na kontra sa current ideology ng isang lipunan.
And among the minority. And of course that represents a very great potential danger. And the reason is to be found. I mean, why is it so? It is not what normally expects. And therefore, a different type of solution has to be found. And perhaps your solution, which you adopted in the Philippines, may not work because the circumstances are quite different.
all right, it might not work. in the
Johnny, wait
Philippines.
just a minute. We've got to give Peter a chance to get back on his point when Ram said that British imperialism had caused communism in India.
You
Entirely.
can't just leave it in the air. You must tell me how British
You see, the point is
imperialism
this. If you assume that poverty produces communism, you make that assumption, don't you?
Yes.
Then you see, then you have to bring out the relationship between British imperialism and poverty. Now, British imperialism caused poverty in India. That's fairly obvious. Because I tell you
maintain
what,
poverty in India.
well, it has helped to perpetuate poverty in
It
India.
hasn't helped to perpetuate
I'll give you an
poverty.
example. For instance, you see, India was not allowed to manufacture her own cotton. She had to produce raw cotton to send to Lancashire. Otherwise, what would have happened to the Lancashire cotton mills?
What would have happened to the cotton if she hadn't had a market for it?
Yes, where would she have sold the cotton? So she had to find India as a market, as a source of raw material, and therefore not allow India to be industrialized. And therefore India is poor. Or even assuming from the other ground that it is the educational system or the educated unemployed who are communists, Well, the result is because the educational system is not coordinated with the economic organization.
Well, in Britain, we consider that the most rampant cause of communism in India is the caste system. The fact that in your society there must be poor and there must be rich.
Far from it. In fact, I think that one of the greatest obstacles to communism in India is the caste system.
I can't see that.
Really? Sa mga hindi po nakakaalam, no, yung caste system po ay ang uri po ng pagkakategorize ng iba't ibang mga tao sa India. Ito po parte ng kanilang kultura. At sa atin po mga Filipino-Indian po na mga viewers po dito, please enlighten us kung ito ba ay strictly na nasusunod sa kanilang mga society kasi napakalaki po kasi ng India. Ano po? Pero yung caste system nga is merong mga rangko ng mga tao, pagkakauri-uri ng mga tao at ang pinaka-last yata is yung untouchables. So sinasabi dito ng British, ang isa sa mga rason ng kahirapan sa India ay ang caste system. So sinasabi naman dito ng Indiano na hindi yan ang obstacle sa kahirapan. So it's the opposite. Interesting.
I can't see that.
Wait a minute. You just said a while ago that that communism springs from poverty, and because of that you blame the British. Now look, the caste system perpetuates poverty in India. It prevents a man from rising better than his father was.
Yes,
the
and
point
can you deny
Gonna
that
ask her, go
in
ahead.
India you find the most extreme poverty and the most extreme richness in the world?
Yes, coming to your question of the caste system and yours.
Precisely.
The point is this, that besides poverty and illiteracy, for communism you also require an atmosphere of challenge, an atmosphere of rebellion, an atmosphere of discontentedness. And that you do not find in India, because the caste system has taught them that the miserable plight in which they are is what they deserve, and there is something that they cannot overrule or something that they cannot challenge.
But there must be some feeling of indignation against that which breeds communism.
I cannot believe that a man would have the mind of a worm, that he would be so spineless, that he would not rebel at the position in which society puts him.
Yes.
Anyway, the caste system doesn't operate anymore, does it? At least for the untouchables.
No, it doesn't, but it is not quite so strong. But the system itself does exist in the villages. But it doesn't in any way help communism. It's one of the chief obstacles to communism. And as far as the big gap between the rich and the poor is concerned, that is again the British.
That
is
was
the
there
direct
before
result
the
of British rule.
came. That was there before the British came.
No, but the British perpetuated it. You know how the British ruled India? They ruled them through the landlords, as they called them. It was the landlords who ruled India.
Before the British came, India was divided up into a small set of princeling states ruled by extremely rich men.
That is right.
Britain carried on that,
Yes,
that
Britain
system.
perpetuated it. Yes, that's
But
right.
they united India. They gave India the most complete civil service system.
The fact that they united India does not mean that they helped India to prevent it from becoming communist.
When India got her freedom from Britain, when she gained her independence, she had a civil service system that gave her at least 3 years advance over Pakistan, because Pakistan had no comparable system of civil service.
Well, Pakistan was under the same administration in the British India. That's not the point. But the point is that imperialism produced poverty, it produced educated unemployed, it produced a state of illiteracy, because you were not educated and interesting, and therefore it produced communism.
I won't listen to the word produced.
Well, it
Okay, interesting. No, tingnan po natin yung logic dito ng Indiano. So imperialism produces poverty and poverty produces socialism. Yun ang kanyang logic. Hindi ako totally agree sa kanyang train of thought dito. Kasi hindi lang naman yung poverty necessarily ang reasons for an ideology katulad ng socialism. So hindi lamang yun. Of course, there's a level of dissatisfaction, social unrest, diba? Or just a total change of political culture na nafe-feel ng mga grupo ng tao. So I don't totally subscribe to the idea kasi ganito yun. Sabi mo, imperialism, tapos it causes poverty, it causes socialism. So ibig sabihin, ang kanyang conclusion agad, imperialism then causes socialism. Not exactly, no. So hindi ako agree doon. Pwede nating masabi na may connection yung poverty and socialism, pero hindi natin pwedeng itawid agad na i-shortcut natin na imperialism is the reason for socialism. So hindi ako agree sa train of thought nitong Indian debater na to.
it caused.
I won't hear that word caused.
All right, would you listen to the word it maintained?
Maintained.
It's the
To
same.
a lesser degree.
It's the same thing.
To a lesser degree.
It doesn't matter whether you cause a man to be poor. What makes it worse is you keep him poor.
But if you keep him poor to a lesser degree, with poverty, there was some education system put into India that wasn't
Yes.
there before.
I agree with that.
Witness the number of people who were able to read and write and go into a civil service.
But you must
Well, look,
admit
kids, let's take the second half of the...
Before that, so very interesting discussion there. So nakita natin na itong the latter end ng kanilang diskusyon ay paglalaban na ng imperialism versus colonized states katulad nga ng India. So naiintindihan mo naman ito yung problema talaga sa imperialismo, talagang nakakaapekto ng psyche ng pag-iisip ng isang society. Although to be fair, it is quite easy for someone to blame imperialism imperialism sa kanilang mga iba't ibang mga bansa. Napaka-fresh pa kasi ng sakit at wounds na nadala nga ng imperialismo sa kanilang bansa kasi 1950s lang ito eh. So hindi mo rin talaga masisisi yung perspective dito ng Indian debater. So makikita mo no na si Antillon was a bit different yung kanyang perspective. It's very interesting and I would say quite progressive to some degree. But then again, dahil nga sa political atmosphere nung panahon na ito eh, it gives me the idea na nung panahon talaga nung 1950s, napakataas ng moral ng mga Pilipino, napakataas ng kanilang belief sa kanilang gobyerno. Kasi makikita mo ang conviction ni Mr. Antillon sa kanyang gobyerno dito eh. Yung pinapahiwatig niyang lakas ng ating armed forces dito, makikita mo talaga yung kanyang trust sa gobyerno. So very interesting dahil kaiba ito sa ating perspective ng typical Filipino sa ating panahon ngayon regarding sa ating bansa.
Question, because after all, British imperialism in India is now a thing of the past, is it not?
Yes.
As we bury it, do you want to say a word or two over its...
Well, I will say one thing, that British imperialism did produce communism in India. But one of the greatest events of this century has been the independence of Asia. The British have acted very statesmanlike in giving independence to India, Pakistan, Burma and Ceylon. This I will say for the British. Because if you had not given independence to India, India might have been communist today. But because you delayed the independence, you caused poverty and illiteracy. And therefore you have helped in India having a potential threat of communism.
Well, how can you explain that the most popular leaders of India against the British were not the communists?
Well, that is because the primary issue then was not against communism, but against, it was nationalism,
India.
directed against imperialism.
Yes, but
Yeah,
you're
British,
saying
I
we
mean.
caused communism in your country. Surely if the British imperialism had caused communism, the people would have followed communism.
Okay, interesting perspective. And there's validity to that point. Sinasabi niya na kung talagang sinasabi mo na ang British imperialism ang nag-cause, ang nag-give way for socialism, eh bakit nung bago mabigyan ng independence ang bansa ninyo, ang mga leader ninyo ay hindi komunista? So ang sinasabi naman nito ng Indiano, ang common kasi na enemy namin ay ang British. Yun ang sagot niya. Medyo mas na-appreciate ko yung argument dito ng British.
You see, the thing that saved it was that communism did not join hands with imperialism. Now take Indochina. In Indochina, it is just that nationalism and communism are joining hands against imperialism, and therefore there is a greater threat of communism.
Johnny, what do you want to say?
I'd like to say one more word over the dead body of British imperialism in India. Ram said that the British acted very statesmanlike in getting out of India. I'd like to say that they did get out, but they got out only because they were pinched. They had to get out. There was no element of statesmanship in it at all.
We got out just in time to appear magnanimous.
That's right.
So I say it myself.
Well, there is a pretty good feeling between the Hindus and the British today, is there not?
Well,
Well,
witness the
definitely.
fact
I
that
hope
even
so.
though India gained her independence, she still remains within the Commonwealth as a
No, that's because
republic.
she chose to, yes. There's no relationship. She chose to of her own
Now,
accord.
there's another half of the question we started out to discuss that we perhaps should deal with for just one more moment. That is there more than one solution for the problem of communism?
Of course.
Certainly.
Of
Well,
course. There's more than one solution to it. Pero yun nga, what is interesting here in this discussion is ang pagtingin ng localized na solution to a universal problem. At least for that time, they really considered socialism to be a deep problem. I'm not a supporter of socialism of sorts. Pero as a former political science professor, ang masasabi ko lang dito is minsan hindi masama na magkaroon ng free market of ideas in the government and then let the people decide ano yung ideology na i-apply nila sa kanilang lipunan. Agree din ako to some level na kapag binawalan mo ang isang ideology, hindi rin maging totally maganda yon dahil kinakailangan natin ng evolution lagi ng pag-iisip para sa kabutihan ng isang lipunan at ang pagka-cut off o ang paghihinto ng isang ideolohiya ay para sa akin hindi naman nakakabuti unless it is patent evil, talagang napakasamang ideolohiya. Syempre kinakailangan na pigilan yon. So this is a good question, no? Parang parting question before they end. Nag-apply ba ang isang solusyon lamang o maraming solusyon? At pangalawa, ano ang posibleng solusyon sa kanilang each na governments dito sa Norway, sa Britain, sa Pilipinas, sa India na sa discussion na ito, maaaring matutunan ng iba pang mga bansa. Pwede natin i-consider na best practices sa pagko-contain, sa pag-restrict ng isang ideolohiya na nakikita ng isang lipunan na hindi maganda.
The thing to do is that first of all you have to be aware that the way of dealing with communism is not to use communist techniques against them, is not to condemn them. Extremism of any form is bad. To counteract communism in communist ways is as bad as communism itself.
Yes, and I think another important thing to notice is that the worst thing you can do to combat communism is not to realize what communism is. I think it is dangerous to limit to confuse the limits, to persecute innocent people.
What is your point, Ram, about the future that we have to look at in India? Do you see a constant communist threat? Do you see it ameliorating at all?
Well, I would say that communism, in fact, I'm very optimistic about the future because communism is never a long-term arrangement. because communism really is barter. You see, you buy your bread and sell your freedom. Because you see, the animal instincts in man are more fundamental than the human instincts. But the moment you get your bread, you want back your freedom. You see? And therefore, communism, in my opinion, is never a long-term arrangement. And really speaking, communism is imperialism. It is a device for imperialism. It is a new way of dealing with imperialism. In the past, for example, the other imperialists like the British had different ways of dealing with imperialism. They made it quite explicit. but the communists have a different type of imperialism. Now they make it in such a way that nationalism is completely dissolved. For example, there is imperialism in China. China is being ruled by Russia today. But the Chinese people owe their primary allegiance not to China, but to the communist world. And therefore, they are dictated by Moscow. But soon a time will come when China will awaken from that slumber and she will realize that she's being ruled by Russia. And therefore, I predict a bitter conflict between China and Russia. And that is inevitable. And the day that conflict comes, that will be the liberation of the world from the shackles of communism.
It's a very optimistic note. Do you agree with this, John?
I think that all these three people are naive in the sense that they are.
Oh, these three people are naive. Wow. Grabe. Napaka-confident nitong debater na ito. This is just way different from Mr. Contreras yung nabigay nating reaction. Pero same, dalawa sila. Napaka-confident ng mga Pilipinong ito, mga teenagers ito ha. So nakakabilib yung kanilang conviction na ipaglaban yung kanilang mga ideas sa isang matalino, sa isang intellectual na diskusyon. I appreciate it so much.
Naive?
Naive because they fail to recognize the fact that communism is not just a self-contained unit in its country. I maintain that it is a worldwide conspiracy, that every communist party in the world is subservient to Moscow, that the sooner you outlaw it, the better, because the sooner shall you have a legal basis on which to proceed against them. Now, some will say that this is using communist tactics. I do not see how that can be. There may be some resemblance, but this is the point. You say that in restricting communism by outlawing it, that you're restricting human freedom. But look, when you restrict freedom, it does not always mean to say that by restricting freedom, it is bad. When you restrict the freedom of a rattlesnake, it is not bad. And the same thing applies to the communists.
I think that it is important to remember that we are not only trying to fight communism, we are also trying to preserve democracy. And I consider freedom of expression as one of the most precious values democracy can offer. And I don't think you can defend democracy by limiting the freedom of expression. You can't defend democracy by losing it.
Well,
Can you answer for that? Wait a minute, Peter. You an answer for that?
I'd like to say that I'm not talking about limiting democracy. You say that we must preserve democracy. And the only way to preserve democracy today is to do away with communism.
It depends on what you mean by democracy. Because the communists say that communism is democracy.
Well, when I say about democracy, I'm speaking of the kind of society in which I now live. I will not go into any argument with the communists. When I say democracy, I mean the society in which I live.
Yes, and a society with freedom of expression for the minorities.
well, I would.
Wait,
say right.
give Peter a chance. He's
Just
only
one
got
point.
about 15 seconds. I'm
All right.
sorry, you've got to give it to him. He
A
needs
man
the
has
last
a right
word.
to speak. I think that communism is the antithesis of freedom, and anyone who endangers freedom, who restricts it, such as outlawing communism, by the restriction of that freedom, is in fact aiding communism.
Well,
I'm sorry, we've got to end there. Next week at the same time, we'll have our final program.
Wow! Whew, ang init ng diskusyon na yon. Wow, kabilib-bilib ang ating kababayan dito. Grabe yung kanyang conviction. So, medyo ad hominem po yan, no? Yung ginawa ni Mr. Antillon nung sa last part, sinabi niya, all these three are naive. So, ang ad hominem po, sa nakakaalam po at sa mga hindi rin nakakaalam, of course, ito po ay ang pagditira po ng persona. Ito po yung pagditira po ng karakteristik ng isang tao without necessarily attacking the arguments of that person. So, sa iba, it's an entertaining debate kapag nagkaroon ng ad hominem. Sa akin, it's not so much. Dahil po ang training po sa formal debates ay dapat walang ad hominem. But anyway, hindi naman ito strict na debate yung nangyari sa kanila. It's more like a discussion. Pero yun nga, grabe yung conviction nito ni Mr. Antillon, ano? And he really thinks that, of course, communism is a worldwide conspiracy. At sinasabi niya na dapat the sooner the better na makontrahan at gawing outlaw ang pag-iisip ng ideya ng sosyalismo o komunismo. Ang ideolohiya na meron po sila nito ay pag-dictate po ng political tension and atmosphere nung panahon nila. Ano po? So talagang grabe yung bangayan ng USSR at ng Amerika nung mga panahon. Ito po yung kalakasan din po kasi ng USSR nung panahon na ito. Grabe yung conviction ni Mr. Antillon kasi nga ito yung panahon na naging successful ang gobyerno gobyerno ng Pilipinas sa pag-handle ng mga militant groups, sa pag-handle ng mga socialist groups noong panahon, dahil nga tandaan po natin ito po yung kapanahunan po ni Mr. Magsaysay na kung saan ang satisfaction level po ng mga masa ay napakataas ng kanilang pagmamahal at respeto sa idolo nga na tinatawag nila na idolo ng masa yan si Pangulong Magsaysay. So, well, gusto ko pong itanong ito before we end our show today. Ano pong masasabi niyo mga ka-youth sa nakita niyo pong diskusyon? Napakagaling, napakahusay po ng ating kababayan. Ano po? 1954. This is officially the oldest debate video na panood po natin sa U3. So mga ka-U3, if you like these kinds of discussions, please comment down below. Lahat po ng inyong mensahe amin pong binabasa. Libo-libo po yung mga nagko-comment dyan sa atin po mga videos every week. Kaya I really appreciate na gawin po natin engaging. Magkaroon po tayo ng magandang diskusyon po sa baba. If you have any comments, if you like our content, please click subscribe mga ka-U3. Sana po ay ma-share niyo po ang video nito sa inyo po mga kaibigan.